NBC News International correspondent Matt Bradley is in Tel Aviv with the latest.
Well, it's been 3 days since the Israelis started allowing other countries to airdrop aid into the Gaza Strip and allow shipments of aid by ground through trucks into the Gaza Strip, kind of opening very slightly the spigot of aid that had been allowed in Gaza after so many people there had been enduring months of an almost complete blockade of any aid going in. And now, just today, we've heard two very symbolic but very grim milestones for this conflict. Just today, earlier this morning, Palestinian health authorities said that 60,000 people have been killed so far in this conflict ever since those October 7th, 2023 Hamas terror attacks set this off. We also heard from one of the main expert bodies on famine and food security in the world, designating that there is a major humanitarian crisis and a famine-like conditions in the Gaza Strip. They did not designate the Gaza Strip as suffering from famine as such, which is something they rarely do. But they did say that this was a worst-case scenario for famine, and they said that there are areas within Gaza where we're seeing famine conditions. Now, famine is a designation that for the most part is something that's going to have to be taken up by the United Nations or by individual countries. But this is something that all of those countries and the United Nations are certainly going to be considering. There was another very grim milestone yesterday. Two Israeli human rights organizations became the first groups of their kind to determine or to designate that Israel's fight in the Gaza Strip was tantamount to genocide. Now, they join other international organizations who have said the same. This just goes to show that we're seeing a paradigm shift, both in what's going on in the Gaza Strip and in perception worldwide and here in Israel about how the Israeli government is conducting that war.
Matt Bradley in Tel Aviv. Matt, thank you. And joining me now is NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba. And Monica, what else did we hear from President Trump about the situation in Gaza today?
Yeah, well, and this comes, of course, Gabe, after those comments yesterday that were quite striking, where he did break with Prime Minister Netanyahu, saying specifically that he didn't accept his assessment that people weren't starving in Gaza. The president saying that he definitely saw those images on the news, and I'm told by a senior White House official that he was quite disturbed and troubled by those images, and he said that you can't fake something like that. So this is a moment where he is trying to talk about now a new U.S. aid plan, potentially some more food centers, he's saying, but we don't have many details about what that's going to look like and how that's going to work. So we've been pressing the White House for that, but it is a clear shift in his tone and in his language, and saying that the humanitarian aid just needs to be a priority, even though there are just very many questions still about how this conflict ends and what role the U.S. would play in that, Gabe.
You know, Monica, do you get the sense that there is growing pressure on the administration to convince Prime Minister Netanyahu to change course? And where does that relationship between Trump and Netanyahu even stand?
I mean, it was a really clear challenge for the last administration for former President Joe Biden, and it continues to be one for current President Trump. When it comes to the relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu, the U.S. can make its position clear, can pressure him, can say what they want to say, and there are just so many examples of Prime Minister Netanyahu not listening to that, not being subject to that kind of pressure, and not really caring. So is there anything that would suddenly change that dynamic? That is the real question. But I think you are seeing President Trump a little bit more public about how he feels about that. And he said that he spoke to Prime Minister Netanyahu just a couple of days ago and that he would be speaking to him again soon. And the real question is, now that the president has also kind of amped his rhetoric up on Hamas, he has talked about them being hunted down and needing to kind of come up with the next phase of what happens to some of those top key remaining Hamas figures. And that's the other issue here, Gabe, that we just don't know what else could be done besides the U.S. calling on Israel to do more to end this suffering for the population of Gaza and Palestinians.
You know, Monica, earlier this year, the president talked about making Gaza the Riviera of the Middle East. He even suggested that the U.S. might take over Gaza in some way. Has the president's posture changed since then?
He's backed off of those comments, Gabe. He is now talking about this idea of could the U.S. play a role in helping to relocate some Palestinians who would want to choose to leave Gaza. He was asked specifically about that today, and he said, look, we need to figure out a lot of other things before we can get to that. And he said that there would be people who would want to leave the territory and the besieged enclave on their own. But that is something that a few months ago, of course, raised a lot of eyebrows. He hasn't really been repeating those comments as much. Instead, he has been a bit more focused, again, on the humanitarian crisis and on those hostages that are still there, those 20 or so who are believed to be alive, that he has met, with many of the U.S. American dual Israeli hostages that have been freed from there. And that's something that he's continuing to try to push for. And we know that the special envoy, Steve Witkoff, had to pull the U.S. out of those latest talks for a potential ceasefire last week, but that it's something he has detailed Steve Witkoff to continue to work on to try to get those remaining hostages out. Gabe.
Monica Alba, live for us outside the White House. Monica, thank you. And joining me now is NBC News Chief Foreign Affairs Correspondent and Chief Washington Correspondent, Andrea Mitchell. Andrea, I want to play some of what the State Department spokesperson said today during the briefing.
No one has denied, we have not denied it in this room, that the humanitarian assistance to this point has not been enough. My argument has been is that it would never be enough in that obscene, unnatural environment. And so we're proceeding in that regard, and of course, with President Trump's leadership, as he noted yesterday, to do even more to assist when it comes to food and other aid.
So, Andrea, as you know well, before today, the State Department had been touting the efforts of the U.S. and Israeli-backed aid group. How significant of a shift in rhetoric is this?
180 degrees by the president and, of course, by his State Department spokeswoman, because they were saying that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was doing enough, but the basic facts that were visible on video, what the president was seeing, was just so compelling. He said, you can't fake that. That is starvation. Despite what the prime minister was saying was that there was no starvation. What are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? And once the president said that, that changed everything. So this week is a dramatic turn. And now the State Department is saying, well, we're doing everything, we can. We have to do more, adjusting the message, if you will. But the bottom line was that the foundation, that was a joint Israeli-American venture, was only distributing food in 4 locations in the South, well guarded by the IDF, which is a violation of international law because the military is not supposed to be guarding food distribution. And that is in contrast to 400 sites all over Gaza, not just in the South, where Israel apparently wants people to move to. And the suspicion is that they will reoccupy the North and militarize it and create a zone of people in the South that they would follow the food, of course. They're desperate for food. So in the World Food Program, the UN had 400 sites all over Gaza. This was 4 sites. It was never going to be enough. And they were very defensive about it.
Well, Andrea, the UK Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, he joined French President Macron in announcing the UK will recognize a Palestinian state. So do you see this gaining momentum, and what would this mean in practice?
Well, in practice, it's really not going to happen. For one thing, the Palestinian Authority has not reformed itself. Mahmoud Abbas is not popular with his own people. He is an elderly leader who has resisted bringing in more, newer people. There are so many Palestinians, economists and others who are experts and who could come in and really change the Palestinian Authority, the leadership in Gaza, to replace Hamas. And then that would enable and would basically give a green light to the very wealthy Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and others, who've said that they will come in then and both secure it and try to help rebuild it because it is a devastated zone. But none of that is going to happen unless there is some viable leadership other than Hamas. So that has been the holdup. And of course, there's no ceasefire. And right now, Hamas really has no leadership. And they were all assassinated by Israel, and now they are resisting obviously the Witkoff negotiations. But the starvation is a separate issue. It really has to be dealt with. And what the world community is saying is that there should not be a blockade. there should be truckloads of UN and other trucks, you know, other agencies delivering food and fuel and water. And, you know, what they need is baby formula. But now the infants are so malnourished that they can't even absorb the formula. So they need all kinds of special fluids. They don't have enough IV fluids. They don't have saline. They don't have enough anesthesia for operations. I interviewed a nurse today for our NBC News podcast, and it is really appalling, an American nurse.
Andrea Mitchell, our chief foreign affairs correspondent. Andrea, as always, we thank you for your time.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.